He was a man built of silence and stone, a lonely cowboy whose heart was a plot of land he had long ago fenced off. She was a woman who arrived with the autumn wind, carrying nothing but a worn carpet bag and a story with missing pages, the truth of her past hidden like a bruise beneath a long sleeve. In the vast, aching quiet of the high plains, their two solitudes were about to collide, forging a bond so fierce it could either save them both or shatter them completely. This is the story of a man who had forgotten how to feel and the woman who taught him that love was not a memory of pain, but a promise of healing. Where are you watching from today? We love to see how far our stories travel. Let us know in the comments, and if you're looking for a place where stories still have soul, be sure to subscribe for more just like this one. Now, let the story begin. Caleb Thorne's world was circumscribed by the jagged line of the mountains to the west and the endless, whispering prairie to the east. His ranch was a testament to his own nature, sturdy, functional, and deeply solitary. The main house, built with his own hands, had 2 floors, but only the ground floor knew the weight of his footsteps. The upstairs rooms, once meant for a life that had been stolen by fever and fate, were sealed behind a closed door and a layer of dust that held his grief in quiet suspension. He moved with a deliberate economy of motion, a large man who seemed to take up less space than he should, as if trying to minimize his own existence. The silence of the house was a living thing, a companion he had come to understand. It was broken only by the crackle of the fire, the groan of old wood, and the distant call of a hawk. He needed a cook. His last one, a grizzled old man named Silas, had passed on a month prior, and Caleb's own attempts at sustenance were rudimentary at best. He tacked a notice to the board in town, expecting little. So when Elara Vance stepped off the morning stagecoach, she was an anomaly, a splash of soft color in his monochrome world. She was not what he had expected. There was a delicacy to her features that seemed ill-suited for the harshness of this land, but her eyes held a strength that contradicted her fragile appearance. They were the eyes of someone who had looked into a deep abyss and had chosen, with every fiber of her being, to climb back out. She carried her past not as a burden, but as a shadow that walked a few steps behind her. "I've come about the position," she said, her voice quiet but clear, holding its own against the vast emptiness of the landscape. Caleb simply nodded, his gaze taking in the slight tremor in her hands as she clutched her bag, the careful way she held herself, as if bracing for a blow. He saw the neat, darn patches on her dress, the resolute set of her jaw. He saw a survivor. He asked few questions, and she offered fewer answers. He didn't ask where she was from, or why a woman like her was seeking such an isolated post. He felt, with an instinct he trusted more than words, that her reasons were heavy enough without him adding the weight of his curiosity. He showed her the kitchen, the small room off it that would be hers. He watched as her gaze swept over the space, not with judgment, but with a quiet, assessing practicality. She ran a hand over the flour-dusted countertop, her fingers tracing a line in the neglect. "I can start now," she said. It was not a question. It was a statement of intent, a quiet claim on this new, small corner of the world. And Caleb, a man who had not willingly let another soul into the heart of his home for 5 long years, found himself stepping aside. He gave a single, curt nod. "The pantry is there. Take what you need." Without another word, he turned and walked out, the jingle of his spurs a lonely sound against the sudden, unnerving promise of another heartbeat within his walls. The first days of Elara's presence were measured in subtle shifts. The oppressive silence of the house didn't vanish, but it changed its character. It was no longer the dead quiet of a tomb, but the watchful quiet of a library, holding the potential for stories. Caleb would return from his long days mending fences or tending to his herd, and the air would greet him differently, carrying the scent of baking bread or simmering stew, aromas he hadn't realized he had missed like a limb. These smells were ghosts of a former life, but instead of haunting him, they offered a strange, tentative comfort. Elara was a phantom of efficiency. She moved through the house with a light step, restoring order to the chaos he had let fester. Dust covers were stripped from furniture he hadn't looked at in years, windows were washed until the afternoon sun streamed in, bright and accusing, revealing the depth of his neglect. She never spoke of the dust, or the grime, or the palpable sorrow that clung to the very walls. She simply cleaned it away, her actions a gentle but persistent form of cleansing that went deeper than wood and glass. He watched her from a distance, his observations filtered through doorways and windows. He saw her in the small kitchen garden, a patch of earth that had long since surrendered to weeds. With a hoe she'd found in the barn and a fierce determination, she began to reclaim it, her hands, surprisingly strong, pulling at the stubborn roots. She was coaxing life from dead soil, and the metaphor was not lost on him. He saw in her labors a reflection of his own soul, fallow and overgrown. Their interactions were sparse, orbiting around the ritual of meals. She would place a plate of food on the table, and he would eat, the scrape of his fork against the ceramic the only conversation between them. Yet, even in this silence, a language began to form. He noticed she learned his preferences quickly. He favored savory over sweet, coffee black and strong. She would leave a fresh pot warming on the stove for his return in the evenings, a small, unspoken gesture of awareness. Inside Caleb, something ancient and frozen began to thaw. He was a man who had walled himself in with the stones of his own grief, cementing them with the memory of his wife's last breath and the terrible stillness of his son's small hand in his. He had believed that love was a door he had locked and thrown away the key. Elara's quiet, unassuming presence was not a battering ram against that door, but a patient, persistent vine, seeking the smallest crack, promising life on the other side. He did not know her story, and she did not know his, yet in the vast, unpeopled landscape of the ranch, they were like two solitary trees whose roots, deep underground, were beginning to tentatively reach for one another, seeking sustenance in the shared dark. He was still a man of stone, but he was beginning to feel the slow, inexorable erosion of her gentle, persistent reign. The rhythm they had established was as fragile as a sparrow's egg, and the first crack appeared on a Tuesday. The air was heavy with the promise of a storm, the sky a bruised purple-gray that mirrored a mark Caleb had not yet seen. Elara was washing the supper dishes, her movements methodical and sure. Caleb sat at the table, nursing a cup of coffee, the silence comfortable. A sudden, violent gust of wind rattled the windowpane with a sound like a sharp slap. Elara flinched, a reaction so profound and instinctual it went far beyond a simple startle. A plate, slick with soap, slipped from her grasp and shattered on the stone floor. The sound was explosive in the quiet kitchen. But it was her reaction that held Caleb motionless. She didn't cry out in frustration. She froze, her shoulders hunching, her head ducking as if to ward off an imminent blow. Her breath hitched in a small, terrified gasp, and for a split second, she looked not at the broken china, but at him, her eyes wide with a deep, primal fear. The look was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by a flush of embarrassment and apology. "I am so sorry, Mr. Thorne," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I'll clean it immediately." It was careless. She knelt, her hand shaking as she began to pick up the larger shards. Caleb rose slowly, his chair scraping against the floor. He saw the way she tensed at the sound. He didn't speak. He went to the broom closet, retrieved a dustpan and brush, and knelt on the other side of the mess. He began sweeping the smaller fragments, his large, calloused hands moving with surprising gentleness. "Leave it," he said, his voice a low rumble. "You'll cut yourself." She looked up, her expression a mixture of confusion and relief. He met her gaze, holding it for a moment longer than necessary, trying to communicate something he had no words for. He saw past her apology to the terror beneath. It was a fear that was old and well-worn, a garment she had been forced to wear for so long it had become a second skin. He finished sweeping and disposed of the broken pieces. He said nothing more about it, and neither did she. But the incident lingered in the air between them, an unspoken question. The next morning, Elara found that the loose, treacherous stone on the back step, the one she had to navigate carefully every time she went to the garden, had been reset. It was level and firm, cemented securely in place. There was no sign of the work, no tools left behind, just the silent, solid evidence of his care. It was a conversation without words. It said, "I saw you stumble. I will not let you fall." And as she stood on that steady stone, Elara felt a tremor of hope, a feeling so unfamiliar it was almost painful. It was in that moment that Caleb, watching from the barn, first noticed the faint, yellowing shadow of a bruise high on her wrist, just where the cuff of her sleeve had slipped back. It was the shape of a man's thumb. The bruise on her wrist was a seed of disquiet planted in Caleb's mind. Once seen, it could not be unseen. He began to watch her more closely, not with suspicion, but with a new, protective alertness. He started noticing things he had previously missed, or perhaps, had chosen to ignore. He saw the way she always wore dresses with long sleeves, even on the warmest days. He saw how she would angle her body away from him when reaching for something on a high shelf, a subtle, practiced maneuver to keep her torso from view. One afternoon, he came in from the north pasture earlier than usual. The sun, slanting through the newly cleaned kitchen window, caught her just right as she turned from the stove. For a fleeting second, he saw it, a dark, ugly mark blooming on her cheekbone, partially concealed with a dusting of powder. She saw him looking. Her hand flew to her face, a gesture of pure, unthinking instinct. "Oh," she said, her voice strained. "Silly me. I walked right into the pantry door this morning. I must have been half asleep. The lie was thin, brittle as autumn leaves. A pantry door didn't leave a mark like that. That was the mark of a fist." A cold, hard anger began to build in Caleb's chest, an emotion he hadn't felt with such intensity since the day he'd buried his family. It was a cold, clean rage, directed not at her, but at the nameless, faceless shadow from her past who had put that fear in her eyes and those marks on her skin. He didn't challenge her lie. To do so would be to corner her, and he could see she was a creature who had been cornered too many times. Pushing her would only make her bolt. He held his tongue, the unasked questions a physical weight in his throat. So he spoke in a different language. The next day, a small, delicate mason jar with a single, resilient prairie wildflower sat on the kitchen windowsill. He'd plucked it from a patch growing stubbornly by the creek bed, its vibrant purple a stark contrast to the dry, brown grass around it. He offered no explanation for it. He didn't need to. It was a symbol of her, of the beauty and strength he saw in her. A few days later, after butchering a steer, he set aside the tenderest cuts not for his own plate, but on a separate platter, covered, on the counter. "For you," was all he said, his voice gruff, before retreating back into his shell. These were his questions. "Who hurt you? What are you running from?" These were his statements. "I see your strength. I see your pain. You are valued here." Ilara understood this silent dialogue perfectly. Each small act of kindness was a balm on a wound she thought would never heal. But it was also terrifying. Kindness was a currency she was not used to, and she didn't know how to repay it. She feared the debt. The safer she felt in Caleb's quiet presence, the more the specter of her past loomed, threatening to rip this fragile sanctuary away. She knew that men like the one she fled did not simply give up. They hunted. And she was terrified of the day the hunt would lead to Caleb Thorne's door. The outside world intruded on a Thursday, arriving in a cloud of dust that was not of Caleb's making. He was high on a ridge, mending a section of fence, when he saw the rider approaching not the ranch, but the town road miles away. It was Sheriff Brody, and he was riding with an urgency that sent a prickle of unease down Caleb's spine. Brody was a friend, a man of few words like himself, and not one for social calls. Caleb met him at the edge of his property line, the two men's horses standing flank to flank, blowing softly. "Caleb," Brody began, foregoing any pleasantries. "Had a man in town today." Asking questions, Brody's eyes were steady, meaningful. "A well-dressed fella. Name of Marcus Vance. Said he was looking for his sister-in-law. A woman named Ilara." The name hung in the air between them, heavy and dangerous. Caleb's expression didn't change, his face remained a mask of weathered stone, but inside, a trapdoor opened and a cold dread dropped into his stomach. "Said she was unwell," Brody continued, his tone laced with skepticism. "Prone to flights of fancy. Said she'd run off with some family valuables." He was real smooth, Caleb. The kind of smooth that sets your teeth on edge. Caleb's gaze drifted back toward his house, nestled in the hollow, now seeming terribly vulnerable. "He showed me a picture of her," and Brody paused. He's offering a reward. A substantial one. For information on her whereabouts, the pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. The fear, the bruises, the secrets. They all had a name now, Marcus Vance. This was the hunter. This was the shadow she had been running from. Told him I hadn't seen anyone matching that description, the sheriff said, his loyalty to Caleb unspoken but absolute. But he's staying at the hotel. Making inquiries. He won't be quiet for long. Caleb gave a slow, deliberate nod. I'm grateful, Sam, just be careful, Brody warned, his eyes grave. Men like that, the ones with money and no morals, they believe the world belongs to them. The sheriff turned his horse and rode away, leaving Caleb alone with the terrible new knowledge. The wind felt colder, the silence of the prairie more menacing. He rode back to the ranch not with his usual, steady pace, but with a new urgency of his own. When he saw Elara in the garden, kneeling amongst the green shoots she had so carefully nurtured, her back to the road, she looked small and terribly exposed. For the rest of the day, a palpable tension settled over the house. Elara could feel the change in him. His silence was no longer watchful, it was guarded. His presence was no longer just a comfort, it was a shield. She didn't know what had happened, but she saw the new hardness in his eyes and her blood ran cold. She knew, with the chilling certainty of the hunted, that the chase was nearing its end. That night, she couldn't eat. She just stared out the window into the encroaching darkness, her face a pale oval in the lamplight, waiting for the sound of hoofbeats that would signal the destruction of her world. The breaking point came after supper. The meal had been a tense, silent affair. Elara had merely pushed the food around her plate, her appetite stolen by a gnawing dread. Caleb had eaten, but his movements were stiff, his jaw tight. The storm that had been brewing inside the house all afternoon was about to break. After clearing the table, Elara didn't retreat to her room as she usually did. She stood by the main window, her arms wrapped around herself, her gaze fixed on the dark horizon as if she could will the danger away by staring it down. The faint light from the oil lamp cast her in silhouette, a lonely, fragile figure braced against the vast, consuming night. Caleb watched her for a long time. He saw the tension in her shoulders, the rigid line of her spine. He saw a woman preparing for a battle she was certain she would lose. He could have remained in his silence. It was his fortress, his oldest habit. But looking at her, he understood that his silence was no longer a shield for himself, but a wall between them, and she was on the wrong side of it. He rose from his chair and walked to stand a few feet behind her. He didn't touch her, but she felt his presence like a change in the atmospheric pressure. "You're afraid," he said. The words were not an accusation. They were a simple statement of fact, spoken in his low, quiet voice. But they landed with the force of a key turning in a lock she had thought rusted shut. A shudder went through her entire body. The careful composure she had maintained for months finally crumbled. A single, choked sob escaped her lips, and then another. She turned from the window, her face streaked with tears she no longer tried to hide. Her carefully constructed walls came down in a torrent of anguish and fear. "He's found me," she whispered, her voice ragged. "I know he has." Caleb's expression remained unreadable, but his eyes held her, steady and present. He did not offer empty platitudes. He simply waited, giving her the space to let the poison out. And so, the story came tumbling forth. Her name was Elara Vance, as the man had said. But Marcus was not her savior, he was her tormentor. He was the brother of her late husband, Thomas. Thomas had been a kind man, but weak, dominated by his wealthy, ruthless family. After Thomas's sudden death from a riding accident, Marcus had become the head of the family, and his cruelty, once hidden, became overt. He had controlled every aspect of her life, treating her as property. The bruises she carried were his handiwork, punishments for perceived slights. "He believes Thomas left something for me," she explained, her words punctuated by shudders. "A deed to a small piece of land with a spring on it. It was my mother's, and Thomas made sure it was in my name alone before he died. It's worthless to them, except that it's the only thing they can't control. For Marcus, that's an unforgivable offense. He wants to break me, to take everything until I have nothing left of myself. She had escaped one night with nothing but the clothes on her back and the original deed sewn into the lining of her coat. She had been running ever since, from town to town, until she'd seen Caleb's notice and prayed this remote ranch would be the one place Marcus would never look. "I'm sorry," she finished, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm so sorry to have brought this trouble to your door." She finally looked up at him, her eyes raw with shame and despair, fully expecting to see anger, or worse, dismissal. Caleb listened to her entire story without interruption. He stood as still as a great pine, his face a landscape of weathered calm, but inside him, a storm was raging. The cold anger he had felt before now coalesced into a sharp, focused point of fury. It was a righteous anger, the kind a man feels when he sees a wolf circling a lamb. He looked at Elara, at her tear-streaked face and trembling hands, and he did not see trouble. He saw the echo of his own loss, the specter of innocence destroyed by a force it could not fight. He saw the same vulnerability that had been in his wife's eyes in her final days, the same helplessness he had felt when he could do nothing to save her or his son. This time, however, was different. This was a threat he could face. This was a monster he could fight. When she finished, her apology hanging in the air like a final, desperate prayer, he closed the small distance between them. He reached out, not to touch her face or her shoulder, but to gently take the dustpan and broom from where she'd leaned them against the wall earlier. He set them aside, a simple, symbolic act of setting aside the past brokenness. Then he met her gaze, and for the first time, she saw past the stoic rancher to the man beneath. His eyes were not cold, they were blazing with a protective fire. "There is nothing for you to be sorry for," he said, his voice low and resonant, each word a stone laid for a new foundation. "This is your home now." The words were so simple, yet they held the weight of a sacred vow. Home. It was a word she hadn't allowed herself to think, a concept she believed she had forfeited forever. He took another step, and this time he did reach for her, his large, calloused hand hovering for a moment before it settled with surprising gentleness on her arm, over the sleeve that hid her scars. His touch was not possessive or demanding. It was solid. Grounding. A silent promise of sanctuary. "You are safe here," he stated, not as a hope, but as a fact. He looked toward the dark window, toward the unseen road and the threat it represented. "He will not touch you. He will not take you from this place." In that moment, the dynamic between them shifted irrevocably. They were no longer a lonely man and his hired cook. The carefully drawn lines of employer and employee dissolved, washed away by her confession and his quiet, fierce declaration. They were partners. Allies. Two solitary souls who had found a common cause in the defense of one another. Elara looked at him, at the unwavering strength in his eyes, and she felt a flicker of something she had thought long dead, courage. The terror was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was no longer her only companion. She was no longer standing alone against the dark. Caleb Thorne, the man of stone and silence, had just declared himself her shield. And for the first time in a very long time, Elara Vance believed she might just survive the night. 2 days passed in a state of heightened suspense. The air on the ranch was taut as a wire, every gust of wind sounding like approaching hoofbeats, every shadow seeming to hold a hidden threat. Yet, within the house, a new kind of peace had settled. The confession had cleared the air, replacing unspoken tension with a shared, quiet resolve. Caleb and Elara moved around each other with a new awareness, their previous orbits now intersecting in small, meaningful ways. He found reasons to stay closer to the house, mending tack in the barn instead of riding to the far pastures. She found herself glancing toward the door not with dread, but with a new confidence in the man who stood between her and the world. The hunter arrived on the 3rd day, just as the sun was beginning its descent, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and red. He did not come as a thug in the night, but as a gentleman in the afternoon. Marcus Vance rode a fine, black stallion, his clothes expensive and immaculate, a stark contrast to the rugged landscape. He was handsome in a cruel, sharp-edged way, his smile practiced and charming, but it didn't reach his cold, assessing eyes. He dismounted at the gate, not presuming to ride directly to the house, an act of calculated, false respect. Caleb met him on the porch. He had been expecting him. He stood with his feet planted slightly apart, his arms loose at his sides, a posture of non-aggression that somehow seemed more intimidating than an overt threat. He was a mountain, immovable and ancient, before which the other man's polished veneer seemed cheap and thin. "Caleb Thorne?" Marcus asked, his voice smooth as oiled leather. He extended a hand, which Caleb ignored. Marcus let his hand drop without a change in his smiling expression. "My name is Marcus Vance. I believe you may have some property of mine from inside the house." Ilara watched through a crack in the curtains, her heart hammering against her ribs. Seeing him there, so bold and confident, brought back a tidal wave of fear. But then her gaze fell on Caleb's broad, unyielding back, and the wave receded. "The only property I have is my own," Caleb said, his voice flat and even. Marcus's smile tightened almost imperceptibly at the edges. "I'm referring to my sister-in-law, Ilara. A troubled woman, I'm afraid. She has taken something that belongs to my family, and for her own safety, she needs to be returned to our care." He spoke as if discussing a piece of lost livestock. "I have papers," Marcus continued, reaching into his coat. "Signed by a judge. They grant me guardianship. She's not well, you see. It would be unwise to stand in the way of the law." He was using the tools of his world, money, influence, the veneer of legality. He expected this simple, backwoods rancher to be intimidated, to yield to the authority of a piece of paper. Caleb didn't even glance at the offered documents. His eyes remained fixed on Marcus's face. "She's not going with you," he said. The simplicity of the statement was its power. It was not a negotiation. It was a finality. For a moment, the mask of civility slipped from Marcus's face, and a flash of raw, ugly fury showed in his eyes. He had not expected this level of resistance. "You are making a grave mistake, Thorne," he hissed, his voice losing its polished edge. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." "I know exactly who I'm dealing with," Caleb replied, his voice dropping lower, colder. "A man who hurts women. A man who mistakes fear for respect. You are not welcome on this land. Leave." Now the challenge was laid bare. Marcus, realizing his charm and legal threats were useless, let the mask drop completely. He glanced past Caleb toward the house, then back, his lip curling in a sneer. "You think you can protect her? You're nothing but a dirt-grubbing farmer. I will be back. And when I return, I will take what is mine. And I will burn everything else to the ground." He turned, swung himself onto his horse with a violent grace, and galloped away, leaving a cloud of dust and impotent rage in his wake. The final confrontation came sooner than Caleb had expected. It came that very night. The moon was a sliver in the sky, offering little light. A profound silence had fallen over the prairie, the kind of deep, listening quiet that precedes violence. Inside the house, every lamp was extinguished. Caleb had told Ilara to go to her room and barricade the door, but she had refused. She stood in the darkened living room, holding an old, heavy shotgun he kept above the mantel. Her hands trembled, but her eyes were resolute. She would not hide. Not this time. They didn't have to wait long. 3 figures on horseback emerged from the darkness, their forms like ink blots against the grey landscape. It was Marcus, flanked by 2 hired men, rough-looking brutes who moved with the casual menace of men paid for violence. They dismounted and approached the house, their intent clear. They meant to break in, to take Ilara by force. Caleb stood just inside the door, his own rifle in his hands. He was calm. All the grief, all the loss, all the rage he had held inside for 5 years had now been honed to a single, sharp point of purpose, to defend this house, to defend this woman. "Last chance, Vance!" Caleb's voice boomed through the door, startling the attackers. "Ride away now and you live to see the sunrise." A harsh laugh was his answer. "The time for talk is over, Thorne," Marcus yelled back. Then came the splintering crash of an axe against the wood of the front door. The assault had begun. Caleb fired a single shot through the door, not aiming to hit, but to warn. It was answered by a volley of pistol fire, bullets thudding into the thick log walls of the house. From a side window, Elara fired the shotgun. The blast roared through the night, the kick of it slamming her back against the wall. It wasn't aimed at a man, but at the ground near their feet, a deafening declaration that this house would fight back from every corner. The battle was short and brutal. One of the hired men tried to smash a window, and Caleb was there, the barrel of his rifle swinging out to meet him, a sharp, cracking blow that sent the man reeling back with a cry of pain. Marcus, enraged, tried to shoulder the weakened door open. Caleb met the force from the other side, a battle of brute strength. But then, the sound they had been praying for cut through the chaos, the thunder of more hoofbeats, approaching fast. It was Sheriff Brody, flanked by 2 deputies, drawn by the sound of gunfire echoing across the still night air. They rode into the ranch yard, rifles raised, their arrival turning the tide in an instant. The 2 hired thugs, seeing the law arrive, threw down their weapons immediately. They were hired for a fight, not a hanging. Marcus froze, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. He was trapped. It was over. But in a final, desperate act of spite, he pulled his pistol and aimed it squarely at the house, at the window where he knew Elara was. Before he could fire, another shot rang out. Not from the sheriff, but from Caleb. The shot was precise, surgical. It struck the pistol in Marcus's hand, sending it flying into the darkness with a metallic clang. Marcus cried out, clutching his stinging, useless hand. The fight was gone from him, replaced by the shock of utter defeat. Sheriff Brody disarmed him and put him in cuffs. The schemer, so arrogant and powerful just hours before, was now just a common criminal, his power broken, his cruelty exposed. As Brody led him away, Marcus shot one last look of pure hatred at the house. But it was not Caleb he looked at. It was Elara, who now stood in the open, splintered doorway, the shotgun held at her side. Her face was pale, but her eyes were steady. She was no longer afraid of him. She had faced her monster, and she had won. In the aftermath of the failed assault, the ranch was a study in quiet restoration. Sheriff Brody and his deputies took the captured men away, their departure leaving behind a silence that felt earned, cleansed. The splintered front door stood as a testament to the night's violence, but it was a scar of victory, not defeat. Caleb and Elara spent the next morning working together to repair it. He planed the wood smooth, his large hands surprisingly deft, while she fetched him tools and held the new planks in place. They didn't speak much, but their shared labor was a form of communication far deeper than words. They were rebuilding not just a door, but the threshold of their new life. The legalities were handled swiftly. The deed Elara had so carefully guarded, combined with the testimony of Sheriff Brody and the violent attack, was more than enough. Marcus Vance's web of lies and influence unraveled completely. He faced charges of assault, kidnapping, and more. His power, built on intimidation, crumbled to dust when confronted by the simple truth. The threat that had haunted Elara for so long was finally, permanently, gone. With the danger removed, the final wall between them came down. The quiet respect and fierce alliance that had grown in the face of conflict now had the space to soften and bloom into something more tender. One evening, a few weeks later, they sat on the newly repaired porch, watching the sunset bleed across the sky. The world was peaceful, washed clean. Caleb turned to her, his usual stoicism softened by the warm light. "I never thanked you," he said, his voice a low rumble. Elara looked at him, confused. "For what?" "For fighting," he said. "You were not a person waiting to be rescued. You stood your ground. You were brave." The praise, coming from this man of few words, meant more to her than anything. "I learned it from you," she replied softly. "You showed me that some things are worth standing for." He reached over and took her hand. His touch was no longer just protective, it was filled with a deep, abiding affection. "Elara," he began, the use of her name a quiet intimacy. "The upstairs rooms in this house have been empty for a long time. I have been empty for a long time. I think it's time to let the light in again." His proposal was not one of flowery romance, but of shared rebuilding. He was offering her not just his heart, but the empty, grieving spaces of his life, asking her to help him fill them with hope again. Tears welled in Ilara's eyes, but for the first time in her life, they were tears of pure, unadulterated joy. She squeezed his hand, her answer in the strength of her grip. Yes, she whispered. Yes, 2 years later, the Thorn Ranch was transformed. The house, once a monument to grief, was now a home. Laughter, a sound Caleb thought he would never hear again within these walls, was a frequent guest. The upstairs rooms were no longer sealed, sunlight streamed through their open windows, and a small bedroom had been lovingly prepared with a hand-carved crib. The kitchen garden had expanded, a riot of color and life that provided for their table and the tables of their neighbors. Caleb was still a quiet man, but his silence was different now. It was the comfortable, contented silence of a man at peace. The stone had given way to fertile earth. Ilara, his wife, moved with an easy grace, the shadows gone from her eyes, replaced by a radiant confidence. The scars of her past had not vanished, but they had faded into the story of her survival, a story that had led her here. One evening, they stood on the porch, just as they had 2 years before. Caleb held their infant son, a beautiful, healthy boy with his mother's gentle eyes and his father's sturdy frame. Ilara leaned against him, her head on his shoulder, her gaze on the vast, peaceful prairie. They had taken 2 broken lives, 2 deep solitudes, and built a sanctuary. They had faced the ghosts of their pasts and had won, not with violence, but with courage, trust, and the fierce, quiet power of a love that had been forged in the fires of adversity. The lonely cowboy had found his heart, and the resilient survivor had found her home. And together, under the endless western sky, they had found their redemption.